The April sun hung low over Redemption Valley, casting long shadows across the weathered faces of men who knew the weight of dirt under their fingernails and the patience required to coax life from stubborn earth. They gathered at the cemetery on the hill where the cottonwoods stood, sentinel their new leaves bright against a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Samuel Crawford's coffin rested above the open grave. Simple pine boards joined with the same precision the old man had brought to everything he touched. No ornate handles, no unnecessary flourish, just honest joinery and a respect for the wood's grain. 19-year-old Sarah Crawford stood apart from the cluster of mourners, her black dress severe against her pale skin, her dark hair pulled back tight enough to make her temples ache. She held a leather-bound journal against her chest, like armor, its cover worn smooth by decades of her grandfather's hands. The townspeople kept their distance, offering those careful glances reserved for the young and the grieving, unsure whether to approach or allow her the dignity of solitude. She preferred the solitude. The preacher's words rolled over her like creek water over stones, expected and unremarkable. Samuel Crawford had been 73 years old, a good man, a God-fearing man, a curious man, perhaps too curious for some folks' comfort, always up on that mesa, with his instruments and his notebooks mapping rocks like other men mapped property lines. Sarah's fingers tightened on the journal. They didn't understand. None of them understood. Marcus Brennan stood near the grave's edge, his considerable bulk casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the smaller mourners around him. At 45, he wore his prosperity like a second-skin tailored coat, despite the heat-polished boots, a gold watch chain glinting at his vest. His ranch sprawled across the valley's richest bottomland, his cattle numbered in the thousands, and his opinion carried the weight of capital in a place where capital meant survival. He caught Sarah's eye and offered a solemn nod. She did not return it. The coffin descended on ropes, the creak of hemp fiber, the only sound besides the preacher's droning benediction. Sarah watched the pine box settle into red earth, watched the first shovelful of dirt scatter across the lid, with the sound like rain on a roof. Her throat remained dry. Her eyes remained clear. She had done her crying alone in the night where it belonged. The gathering dispersed in that awkward way of funerals, people speaking in hushed tones about weather and crops and anything except the man-shaped hole in the world. Sarah remained rooted, the journal still pressed to her ribs, until only Brennan and the cemetery keeper lingered. Brennan approached with the careful gait of a large man trying to appear gentle. "Miss Crawford," he said, removing his hat. "Your grandfather was a singular individual. We'll all miss his perspective." The pause before perspective hung in the air like smoke. "Thank you, Mr. Brennan. I understand he left you his property. The homestead and the mesa," Sarah finished. "Yes." Brennan's expression arranged itself into something approximating sympathy, though his eyes remained calculating, always calculating. "That's a hard inheritance for a young woman alone. Steep land, no water access. Can't graze it, can't farm it. Just rock and scrub as far as the eye can see." Sarah said nothing. "I'd like to make you an offer." Brennan continued, "Call it $40, more than fair for land that yields nothing. We'll give you a start somewhere else, a city maybe. Opportunities for a woman of your education." The word education carried its own subtle poison. In Redemption Valley, too much learning was viewed with the same suspicion as too much silence. "The land isn't for sale, Mr. Brennan. Now, Miss Crawford, I understand sentiment, but sentiment doesn't pay bills or put food on a table. Your grandfather was a dreamer, God rest him, but dreams don't plow fields." Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My grandfather was a geologist, Mr. Brennan. He didn't dream. He observed, measured, and drew conclusions based on evidence. There's a difference. Be that as it may, the land isn't for sale." She turned and walked down the hill toward the valley, her back straight as surveyors measure, the journal still clutched in both hands. Behind her, Brennan settled his hat back on his head and watched her go with the expression of a man who'd made a reasonable offer and couldn't fathom its rejection. Sarah's boots raised small clouds of dust on the dry road. The homestead waited a mile distant, a modest structure of weathered clapboard and stone chimney that Samuel had built with his own hands 40 years prior. She'd lived there since she was 9 years old, since the river crossing that took her parents, since Samuel had arrived at the county orphanage with his quiet eyes and his steady hands and his simple declaration, "She's mine. I'm taking her home." The interior held that particular stillness of houses whose occupants would not return. Samuel's surveying equipment still stood in the corner. The theodolite on its tripod, the measuring chains coiled like sleeping snakes, the rock hammer with its worn leather grip. His collection of geological samples lined shelves he'd built level as prayer. Everything in its place, everything purposeful. Sarah set the journal on the kitchen table and lit the lamp. Though sunset was still an hour off, she needed the light for reading. The journal fell open to pages she'd studied 100 times, maps and cross-sections drawn in Samuel's meticulous hand. The mesa dominated the drawings, that broad-top plateau of limestone and sandstone that loomed over the valley's eastern edge like a judgment. Everyone called it worthless. Samuel had called it something else. He'd called it salvation. As Sarah traced her finger across a notation about the Redemption Sandstone Formation, something caught her eye. A slight irregularity in the binding near the journal's spine. A page that sat differently from the others, as if it had been inserted rather than sewn. She opened the journal flat, examining the page more closely. It was thicker than the others folded once. Not a map. Something else. With careful fingers, she unfolded it. A letter. Written in Samuel's hand, but different from his technical notes. The script was shakier, written during the last months when the tremor had worsened. The ink was fresher than the rest of the journal's pages. Recent. "My dearest Sarah," it began. "If you are reading this, I am gone, and you have inherited both burden and blessing. You hold in your hands not just a journal of geological observations, but a complete engineering solution to a crisis I will not live to see, but know with certainty is coming." Sarah's breath caught. She sat down slowly, the letter trembling in her hands. The valley thinks itself blessed with abundant water. They are fools. I have tracked the weather patterns for 40 years. The drought cycle is as predictable as the seasons, only longer. 7 lean years are coming, Sarah. Perhaps not this year or next, but soon. Within 5 years of my death, I would wager. I spent 2 decades mapping the mesa, not out of idle curiosity, but out of desperate preparation. The Kanat system I have designed in these pages is not theoretical. It is precise. It will work. The mathematics are sound. The geology is favorable. What it requires is not genius, but patience, persistence, and the courage to be right when everyone else is wrong. You have all 3 qualities in abundance. I did not build this system myself because I am old and my time is short, but more importantly because the valley will not listen to warnings about a crisis they cannot yet see. They must feel the drought's teeth before they will accept the cure. And by then I will be dust. But you, Sarah, you will still be here, young, strong, stubborn as the bedrock itself. This is not a request. This is a certainty I entrust to you as fact. You will build this system. You will save the valley. They will mock you first, then beg you, then revere you. In that order. Do not let their mockery deter you. Do not let their begging corrupt you. And do not let their reverence trap you into hoarding what you have learned. Your true inheritance is not the mesa or the water system. It is the knowledge itself. Guard it. Use it. But above all, teach it. Make sure it never dies with one person again. I love you. I believe in you. The stone will weep for those patient enough to ask. Begin when the drought comes, not before. They must be desperate enough to learn. Your grandfather, Samuel Crawford, written this 14th day of January 1876. Sarah sat in the empty house, the letter in her lap as the lamp burned low, and shadows gathered in the corners. Samuel had known, had planned, had prepared not just the engineering solution, but the social strategy. He'd understood that knowledge offered too early would be dismissed, but knowledge withheld until crisis would be treasured. He'd mapped not just geology, but human nature itself. And he'd chosen her to execute it all. The weight of it should have crushed her. Instead, she felt a strange calm settle over her shoulders like a cloak. This was not hope or ambition. This was certainty. Samuel had seen the future and had built a bridge across it for her to walk. She refolded the letter carefully and placed it back in the journal's binding. Then she turned to the technical pages and began to study with new purpose. Not learning anymore. Preparing. The drought would come. She would be ready. The next 2 years passed in a rhythm of careful preparation, disguised as ordinary living. To Redemption Valley, Sarah Crawford was the orphaned seamstress, quiet and competent, sitting in her corner of Mrs. Henderson's dress shop, with needle and thread taking in hems and letting out waistbands invisible as wallpaper. No one saw her real work. At night, by lamplight, she studied Samuel's journal until the calculations embedded themselves in her mind like muscle memory. She memorized the triangulation points he'd established on the mesa. She worked through his load-bearing mathematics, checking his figures, running her own parallel computations. She found 2 minor errors in his original estimates and corrected them, making notes in the margins with the same careful script he'd taught her. On Sundays, when the valley gathered for church and social calls, Sarah rode the old mule up the mesa's winding trail. She carried surveying equipment piece by piece, caching it in a shallow cave near the summit. She walked Samuel's triangulation points, verifying his measurements, adding her own observations. She purchased tools in careful increments. A new pickaxe from the hardware store in Millerton, 20 miles south. Used drill bits from an estate sale. Hemp rope from a freighter passing through. Nothing that would draw attention. Nothing that would invite questions. Her savings grew with equal patience. Every dollar from seamstress work went into a wooden box beneath her floorboards. By December of 1878, she had $47.35. The drought announced itself in whispers before it came in shouts. November 1878 brought snow that melted before it could accumulate. December's cold snap lasted 3 days instead of 3 weeks. Redemption River dropped a foot, but rivers rose and fell. Nothing to panic about. By late December, the whispers turned to conversations. The winter wheat looked sparse. Brennan's range cattle clustered near remaining water sources, and the grass they grazed had gone brittle and brown. On December 20th, the town council called an emergency meeting. Sarah sat in the back of the town hall. 30 or so men filled the chairs and lined the walls, faces wind-burned and worried. A handful of women clustered near the door. Respectable wives allowed to observe but not participate. Marcus Brennan stood at the front, his bulk commanding the room. "Gentlemen, we face a situation that requires clear thinking and decisive action. The river is at its lowest level in recorded history. I've consulted with the territorial surveyor. He recommends deepening the town well to 70 feet. Cost will be approximately $800. I propose we levy a special assessment on all property owners to fund this work." John Miller, a farmer whose land bordered Brennan's, raised a weathered hand. 70 feet's a long way down, Marcus. What if the water tables drop below that? Then we go to 80. Or 90. The point is to get ahead of the problem before it becomes a crisis. More nods. The logic seemed sound. Dig deep enough, you hit water. Simple as gravity. Sarah stood. The room's attention swung to her like a compass, to north, surprised and slightly uncomfortable. Brennan's expression arranged itself into benevolent patience. "Miss Crawford, if you have a concern, deepening the town well won't solve the problem." The silence held a quality of collective confusion. Sarah walked to the front of the room, carrying Samuel's journal like a legal brief. She set it on the table and opened it to a marked page, rotating it so the room could see the cross-section diagram. The shallow aquifer that feeds your wells is recharged by the river. When the river drops, the aquifer drops. Digging deeper only buys time. The reliable water source isn't below the valley floor. It's in the sandstone formation of the mesa. Every eye in the room tracked to the plateau, visible through the hall's eastern windows. Robert Webb, who owned the mercantile, let out a skeptical laugh. "That pile of rock, Miss Crawford, there's nothing up there but lizards and regret." "There's an aquifer," Sarah said, her voice level. "The Redemption Sandstone Formation. Porous rock that's been absorbing and storing water for thousands of years. Protected from evaporation by the shale caprock. The water is there. It just needs to be accessed properly." Brennan leaned forward, his patience beginning to fray. "Even if water exists in that formation, which I doubt, accessing it would be impossible." Sarah flipped to another page, showing the Kanat diagram. "Not impossible. Difficult. This is a vertical shaft to penetrate the caprock and reach the sandstone layer. From there, horizontal galleries collect seepage. The water accumulates in a central reservoir and can be piped down to the valley. It's called a kanat. It's been used successfully in desert regions for 3,000 years. The room absorbed this in stunned silence. Then the laughter began, scattered at first, building to a wave of incredulous amusement. "Digging in solid rock," Miller said, wiping his eyes. "Miss Crawford, do you have any idea how long that would take?" 6 months, Sarah said. "One person, with the right tools and the correct methodology." The laughter intensified. Brennan held up a hand, silencing the room. "Sarah." The use of her first name was deliberate infantilizing. "Your grandfather filled your head with grand ideas, but we're discussing practical matters, engineering, construction. The town well is a proven solution. Your kanat is a fantasy." "It's mathematics," Sarah said. "Geology, physics, none of which care about your opinion of their feasibility." The temperature in the room dropped. Brennan's face hardened. "I'm trying to be patient with you, girl, out of respect for Samuel, but this council has real work to do. We don't have time for fairy tales." Sarah closed the journal carefully, deliberately. "I'm informing you that the shallow aquifer will fail. The town well will go dry no matter how deep you dig. And when it does, you'll understand that dismissing evidence because you find it inconvenient is the definition of foolishness." She turned to leave. Brennan's voice stopped her. "Wait." She turned back. Brennan pulled out his wallet, extracted bills, counted them onto the table. $50 for the Mesa property. More than generous for worthless land. Take it, Sarah. Go somewhere you can build a real life." The room waited. $50 could buy passage east, could stake a fresh start, could fund a year in a city. Sarah walked back to the table, picked up the journal, left the money where it lay. "The land isn't for sale, Mr. Brennan. I'll begin work tomorrow morning. When I succeed, perhaps this council will learn the difference between opinion and expertise." She walked out into the December night, leaving a hall full of men united in their certainty that the poor orphan girl had finally cracked under the weight of her grief. Behind closed doors, in low voices, they agreed it was sad. Then they voted to fund the deepening of the town well, and forgot about Sarah Crawford and her impossible plan. December 21st, 1878 dawned clear and cold. Sarah rose in darkness, ate a breakfast of oatmeal and black coffee, and loaded her tools onto the mule pickaxe. Shovel, sledgehammer, iron wedges, a coil of rope, 2 oak buckets, and Samuel's journal wrapped in oilcloth. The ride up the Mesa Trail took an hour. As the sun crested the eastern mountains, Sarah reached the summit. The view stretched forever. The valley below still held shadows. The town a cluster of buildings along the river's silver thread. Brennan's ranch sprawled to the south. To the west, the mountains wore their thin coat of snow like an apology. Sarah dismounted and walked to her chosen spot, the location Samuel's triangulation had marked as optimal. 4 white stones already ringed it, placed during her survey work. A circle 4 feet in diameter, perfectly measured. She spat on her palms, gripped the pickaxe, and swung. The point bit into hard pan soil with a shock that traveled up the hickory handle into her shoulders. She wrenched it free and swung again. By noon, she'd excavated 6 inches. By sunset, 1 foot. Her hands bled from burst blisters. Her shoulders screamed with fatigue. Every muscle in her back had discovered new ways to protest. She didn't stop. The first week established the rhythm that would define the next 6 months. Rise before dawn, ride up, dig until she couldn't see, ride down, sleep, repeat. The soil gave way to clay, dense and sticky. Sarah learned to work it when it was slightly damp, when the clay held together enough to remove in chunks. 4 feet down, she hit the caprock. Shale. Dense, layered, impermeable. The material that had kept the sandstone aquifer sealed for millennia now became her adversary. The pickaxe that had worked adequately through soil rang off the shale like a bell. Each strike chipped away flakes the size of coins. Progress slowed to inches per day. Sarah rigged the winch system Samuel had described in his journal. 2 juniper posts set in the rock on either side of the shaft, supporting a greased axle. The rope ran through a block and tackle, allowing her to haul the heavy buckets of debris to the surface. Using mechanical advantage, on the valley floor, life continued. The town well project began crews of men digging in shifts. They reached 40 feet in the first week, 50 feet by the second. Water still flowed, though reduced. The crisis seemed manageable. They didn't look up at the mesa. They didn't see the solitary figure descending into stone day after day alone. On January 2nd, 1879, 2 weeks into her project, Sarah arrived at dawn to find her shaft filled with debris. Not collapsed, filled deliberately. Rocks and brush had been thrown in, filling the excavation back to within 3 feet of the surface, and in the frost-rimed dirt around the shaft's edge, fresh horse tracks. Multiple horses. Sarah stood at the edge looking down at the destruction. Her hands calloused now, but still raw in places tightened on the pickaxe handle. She could walk away. Take Brennan's $50. Admit defeat. Or she lowered herself into the shaft and began removing the fill 1 bucket at a time. It took 3 days to clear the debris. 3 days of redigging the same hole of breathing dust raised by her own reversed labor. On the 3rd day, as she pulled the last bucket of fill to the surface, she found herself smiling. They wouldn't have bothered sabotaging if they didn't fear she might succeed. The fear meant doubt, and doubt meant a crack in their certainty. She returned to the shale with renewed focus pickaxe, ringing against stone in a rhythm that echoed across the mesa top like a heartbeat. 8 feet, 10 feet, 12 feet. January crawled forward. In the valley below the town well reached 70 feet. The water they found was brackish and thin. Brennan authorized extending to 80 feet. The cost of the project climbed toward $1,200. The river shrank to a brown trickle. The first cattle began to die. Sarah reached 14 feet on January 10th. The shale remained consistent, greasy gray flakes that coated everything. She was eating cold beans from a can when she heard it. A different sound. The pickaxe swung with the same force as 1,000 previous swings punched through the shale layer, with a soft sucking sound instead of the usual ring. Sarah froze, set down the pickaxe, pulled the lantern closer. Where the pick point had penetrated a small hole the diameter of a finger opened into darkness below. And from that hole a breath of air rose, cool, damp, carrying a scent she'd almost forgotten in the dry weeks above ground. The scent of deep earth and water. Sarah knelt in the narrow shaft, her face inches from that small opening, and felt the cool air on her skin like a benediction. With shaking hands, she widened the hole using an iron wedge and the sledgehammer. Chips of shale fell away. The opening grew to the size of a dinner plate. She thrust her hand through, reaching down, fingers searching. Her fingertips touched wet sand. Redemption sandstone. The water-bearing formation. She pulled her hand back. Her fingers glistened in the lamplight, coated with damp grit. For the first time since Samuel's funeral, Sarah Crawford allowed herself to cry. Not from grief this time, from the profound relief of being proven right. She sat in that narrow shaft 16 feet below the mesa surface, her hand wet with seepage from ancient stone. And she whispered to the darkness, "You were right, Samuel. It's here. Just like you said." The stone didn't answer, but the slow accumulation of moisture on her fingers, the patient seepage from porous sandstone that had waited 1,000 years to be asked, spoke its own confirmation. The real work was about to begin. The transition from vertical excavation to horizontal construction required a shift in thinking that would have defeated most engineers. Sarah spent 3 days simply studying the problem, sitting at the base of her shaft, with Samuel's journal open across her knees, lamplight throwing her shadow against wet sandstone. The central chamber would be 12 feet wide, 16 feet long, 7 feet high, large enough to work in, large enough to serve as the heart of a collection system that would expose 2,000 square feet of water-bearing stone to air. Sarah marked the chamber boundaries using a straight edge and a carpenter's square scoring lines in the sandstone with an iron spike. The mathematics were unforgiving. Samuel's calculations allowed for structural columns every 8 feet, load-bearing pillars 3 feet in diameter. She began with the drill and wedge method. The hand drill was a steel rod, 18 inches long, hexagonal, in cross-section, with a star-shaped cutting tip. Sarah placed it against the stone, struck it with the sledgehammer, rotated it a quarter turn, struck again. Strike, turn, strike, turn. The rhythm became meditation. She drilled a line of holes 4 inches apart, each one 8 inches deep. When the line was complete, she hammered iron wedges into the holes, starting at one end, working systematically along the row. The wedges bit into the stone. Pressure built. Sarah tapped each wedge in sequence, a fraction of an inch at a time. Then, with a sound like a sigh, the stone fractured. A slab 2 inches thick, separated from the face, held together along the natural bedding plane of the sedimentary rock. Sarah used a pry bar to lever it away, and it fell with a wet slap to the chamber floor. Progress measured in square feet per day. The stone's moisture became more apparent as she penetrated deeper into the formation. The surface of the sandstone didn't just glisten. It actively wept. Tiny beads of water formed, coalesced, grew heavy enough to overcome surface tension, and trickled downward. Sarah caught one of these trickles on her finger, brought it to her lips. Clean, cold, slightly mineral, but not unpleasant. The taste of stone and time. She carved a shallow groove along the chamber's perimeter, a channel 2 inches wide and an inch deep, sloping gradually toward what would become the central sump. Every trickle, every drop would follow this groove to the collection point. By mid-February, the main chamber had taken shape. Water already pooled in the sump pit, a shallow depression, 6 inches deep, fed by constant seepage. The galleries would be the real test. 4 tunnels radiating from the central chamber like spokes from a wheel's hub. Each one 2 feet wide, 5 feet high, 50 feet long. Sarah chose to work on the eastern gallery first, aligned with the subtle downward tilt of the sandstone formation. The confinement was worse than the shaft had been. The gallery was a tube of stone barely wide enough for her shoulders, low enough that she worked on her knees. As she advanced, the chamber's lamplight faded behind her. 10 feet in, she had to begin hauling debris backward on her belly, dragging the bucket behind her, emerging into the chamber coated in red grit and sweat. 15 feet into the eastern gallery on February 23rd, the stone taught her about consequences. Sarah had just wedged a section of ceiling working above her head in the cramped space when she heard the groan. Not the sigh of controlled fracture, a deeper sound, the voice of failing stone. She had time to register the meaning, not quite time to move. The slab fell, 100 pounds of sandstone. It caught her left hand against the gallery floor, pinning it with the certainty of geological time. The pain arrived a heartbeat later, white and absolute. Sarah screamed into the darkness, the sound swallowed by stone. Her right hand scrabbled for the pry bar, found it, jammed it under the slab's edge, levered with strength born of panic. The slab shifted a fraction of an inch. She pulled her crushed hand free and the slab crashed back down. Sarah crawled backward through the gallery, her vision sparking with pain, her left hand a useless mass of agony. She emerged into the chamber and collapsed beside the sump. In the lamplight, her hand looked wrong, swollen, already purpling. The little finger bent at an angle that defied anatomy. Broken. Certainly 2 fingers, possibly more. The climb up the ladder, one-handed, took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Each rung jarred the broken bones. Sarah bit through her lower lip to keep from crying out. On the surface, the sun hung high in a cloudless sky. The valley spread below, peaceful and utterly indifferent to her suffering. Sarah sat on the rim of the shaft and tended her hand with the same precision she brought to rock work. Washed the wound. Examined the fingers. The little finger was clearly broken, the ring finger possibly fractured. She found straight sticks among the juniper scrub, tore strips from her spare shirt, splinted the broken fingers against the straight ones. Her right hand did the work while her left hung useless and screaming. Then she climbed back down the ladder and returned to work. The eastern gallery had to be completed. She returned to it, dragging the pry bar, and spent 2 hours breaking the fallen stone into pieces, small enough to remove. Working one-handed. Methodical. By sunset, she'd cleared the debris and advanced another foot. For the next week, Sarah worked with her left hand bound and useless. She learned to swing the sledgehammer right-handed, adjusted her grip, compensated with shoulder and core strength. The eastern gallery reached 20 feet, 25, 30, and something remarkable began to happen. The moisture seeping from the gallery walls didn't evaporate. It trickled along the floor groove Sarah had carved following gravity, and the 2-degree slope back toward the chamber. Back toward the sump. When she checked the central pit on March 1st, the water level had risen 3 inches, perhaps 5 gallons now. The system was working. Sarah's hand healed slowly. After 2 weeks, she could flex the fingers, though pain still shot through them. After 3 weeks, she removed the splint. They'd set crooked but solid. The little finger would always cant slightly inward. She returned to 2-handed work and doubled her progress. While Sarah excavated her cathedral beneath the mesa, the valley descended into crisis. The town well had reached 85 feet by early March. The water they found there was not just brackish, but actively foul-tasting of minerals and something organic and wrong. Redemption River had stopped flowing entirely. What had been a ribbon of water was now a cracked expanse of dried mud. The cottonwoods along its banks began to die from the roots up. Marcus Brennan's cattle herd, numbered at 3,000 head in November, stood at fewer than 800 by mid-March. His ranch hands dug wells in the pastures, finding nothing but dry sand. The exodus began in late March. Families loaded wagons and left for anywhere that still had water. The town that had been a thriving community of 200 souls shrank to fewer than 80. They deepened the town well to 90 feet, found mud. They prayed for rain. The sky remained pitiless blue, and on the mesa above them, invisible in her stone cathedral, Sarah Crawford carved the 2nd gallery, then the 3rd, then the 4th, each tunnel extending 50 feet into living rock. By April 1st, the sump held 12 inches of water, 20 gallons. A week later, 18 inches, 35 gallons. The collection rate was accelerating. She no longer had to haul every drop up from below. She kept a barrel topside now, filling it bucket by bucket with water from the sump. Clean water. Cold water. On April 15th, Marcus Brennan rode up the Mesa Trail. He came at night alone without the retinue of ranch hands or the swagger of public authority. Sarah was working by lantern light in the stone hut she'd built over the shaft entrance, updating her engineering journal with the day's measurements. She heard the horse before she saw it, and she emerged to find Brennan dismounting his bulk, made shapeless by shadow. "Miss Crawford." "Mr. Brennan, it's late for a social call." He stood there, hat in his hands, and for the first time since she'd known him, Marcus Brennan looked old. The flesh of his face hung loose. His eyes held the hollow quality of fear. "My daughter," he said. "Emma. She's sick. Fever. Doc says it's the water. The town well water. She needs clean water to flush the poison out." Sarah said nothing. Waited. "The town well is contaminated," Sarah finished. "I know. Sulfur and likely sewage seepage from the cemetery. Samuel warned the council about that 15 years ago." Brennan's jaw worked, but no sound came out. Sarah walked to the barrel near the hut entrance, dipped a ladle into it. The water that filled the cup was crystal clear. She walked back and held it out. Brennan stared at it like a man hallucinating. Then he took it and drank, his throat working in great swallows. "How long until you can supply the valley?" His voice was barely a whisper. 6 weeks, maybe 8, if I work without interruption." "What do you need?" Sarah studied him. This was Marcus Brennan broken. This was pride ground to dust. Capital. $80 for final materials. Timber for piping. Clay for ceiling. Brennan reached into his coat without hesitation. Pulled out a leather wallet. Counted bills onto the barrel top. Didn't stop until he'd laid out $100. "Take it all. Emma's not the only child drinking poison. Finish this, Sarah. Please." The use of her first name, stripped of condescension, almost broke through her composure. "I will," she said. Brennan turned toward his horse. Stopped, turned back. "I filled in your shaft. That first week. Me and 2 of my hands. Thought we were saving you from yourself. I know. You knew horse tracks. Your gelding favors his left rear, leaves a distinctive print. A long silence, and you didn't." He couldn't finish the sentence. "Revenge is for people with time to waste," Sarah said. "I don't have that luxury." Brennan mounted his horse, a heavy man moving like he carried twice his weight. "Your grandfather would be proud of you." "Yes," Sarah said simply. "He would." She watched him ride down the trail. Then she returned to her journal, added a line item for materials procurement, and calculated the revised timeline. 6 weeks. She could do it in 6 weeks. The money changed everything. The next morning, Sarah rode down to Redemption Valley. The town bore little resemblance to the prosperous settlement she remembered. Half the buildings stood empty. The streets lay silent. At the general store, Clara Wells looked up from her counter with genuine shock. Sarah Crawford. Lord have mercy, child. I thought you died up on that rock pile." "Not yet, Mrs. Wells. I need supplies." Sarah laid out her list. Hollowed log sections for piping, pine pitch for ceiling, oak timber, clay, iron fittings. Clara's eyebrows climbed. "And you have the capital for this." Sarah laid Brennan's $100 on the counter. Clara stared at the bills like they'd fallen from heaven. "I'll have it ready in 3 days. Have to order some items from Millerton." "Thank you." As Sarah turned to leave, Clara's voice stopped her. "Is it true that you found water up there?" Sarah met her eyes. "Yes, ma'am. It's true. And you'll share it when it's ready." "Under fair terms, yes." Clara's weathered face arranged itself into something like hope. "Then God bless you, child. And God rest Samuel's soul for teaching you his wisdom." Sarah rode back up the mesa with the knowledge that her work was no longer abstract. People were dying. Children were sick. And she held the solution in her blistered hands and broken fingers, and the knowledge embedded in her skull. She returned to the galleries with renewed focus. The fourth and final tunnel reached completion on May 3rd. 50 feet of hewn stone, 2 feet wide, 5 feet high, perfectly aligned with the chamber's northwest axis. 4 galleries, 200 feet of linear excavation. Combined with the central chamber, over 2,000 square feet of water-bearing sandstone exposed to air. The sump now held 4 feet of water. The reservoir she'd carved 10 feet in diameter and 5 feet deep was more than half full. She calculated the volume roughly 2,000 gallons, and still rising. Sarah spent the next week on engineering refinements. She lined the collection channels with flat stones fitting them precisely. She sealed every joint with clay. She carved inspection ports at strategic points. The distribution system came together through May, like a puzzle whose pieces finally revealed their purpose. The hollowed log sections, each 10 feet long and 8 inches in diameter, joined with iron collars and sealed with pine pitch. She built a control valve from oak and leather, a simple gate that could regulate flow. Open it fully and the system delivered 10 gallons per minute. Restrict it and the flow slowed to a trickle. By May 28th, the underground system was complete. The pipeline was assembled. The control valve was installed. Now for the final test. Sarah descended into her cathedral one last time before the connection. She'd spent 6 months in this stone womb. The crooked fingers of her left hand would always carry the memory. The calluses on her palms would never fully fade. She placed her hand on the wall one final time, feeling the cool moisture. "Thank you for the water. Thank you for teaching me patience." Then she climbed out and sealed the access hatch, protecting the system from contamination and evaporation. The 7-day monitoring test began on June 1st. Sarah installed calibrated measuring stakes in the sump, marking water level to the 1/4 inch. She opened the control valve to a specific setting calculated to draw 8 gallons per hour. Then she watched. Day 1, water level stable. Seepage rate matched draw rate. Day 2, same result. Sarah ran the numbers again, checking her mathematics. Day 3, stable performance. The system held equilibrium. Day 4. Sarah noticed something. A faint cloudiness in the water she'd drawn into a glass jar. She held it to the light. Particles suspended in the water. Fine sediment. She descended into the chamber and examined the sump closely. A thin layer of reddish-brown sediment had accumulated at the bottom. Not much, perhaps a quarter inch, but visible. Sarah's heart sank. The seepage was bringing not just water, but fine particles of sandstone clay minerals loosened from the formation. Over time, this sediment would clog the distribution system. Worse, it made the water aesthetically unpleasant, even if not dangerous. She sat on the stone bench she'd carved and faced the problem. 6 months of work. A functioning system. Water flowing. And now this. Samuel's journal had mentioned sediment as a potential issue in Kanat systems, but his notes had been vague. Allow settlement time was all he'd written. But how much time and how to manage it in a system that needed to deliver water continuously? Sarah spent the rest of day 4 thinking. Day 5, she had a solution. She carved a secondary settling chamber, smaller than the main sump positioned upstream in the collection flow. Water would enter this chamber first, allowing sediment to settle before the clearer water overflowed into the main reservoir. She spent 2 days excavating this addition, carving it into the chamber floor adjacent to the sump. 3 feet wide, 5 feet long, 2 feet deep. She positioned the overflow carefully, ensuring that water had to rise slowly through the settling chamber before entering the main collection point. The principle was simple: give sediment time to fall out of suspension before the water reached the distribution system. Day 6, she redirected flow through the new settling chamber. Day 7, she examined both chambers. The settling chamber held a visible layer of sediment at its bottom. The main sump's water was noticeably clearer. She drew a jar of water from the main reservoir, held it to lamplight. Crystal clear. No cloudiness. The modification worked. Sarah added the settling chamber to her engineering diagrams, documenting dimensions, flow patterns, sediment accumulation rates. Future builders would need to know this. The challenge and its solution. On the evening of the 7th day, she sat on the rim of the shaft and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction that went deeper than pride. She had done it. She had carved a cathedral from stone. She had solved problems as they emerged. She had honored Samuel's legacy in the most complete way possible. And she had saved a valley that had tried to sabotage her, that had mocked her, that had offered her money to quit. She stood, walked to the edge of the mesa, and looked down at Redemption Valley. The late sun painted the dying cottonwoods gold. The dried riverbed cut across the landscape like a scar. And along the trail from the town, tiny in the distance, a line of people was climbing. 30 or more, maybe the entire remaining population. Walking slowly in the heat, heads down, moving like pilgrims toward a shrine. They were coming. Sarah watched them approach. Watched them struggle up the switchback trail. Watched them emerge onto the mesa's flat crown. and stopped staring at the stone hut she'd built at the pipeline running down the slope at her. Standing silent and waiting, Marcus Brennan led them, his bulk diminished by months of crisis, his daughter Emma walking beside him, pale but alive. They stopped 10 feet from Sarah. None of them seemed to know how to begin. Finally, Brennan removed his hat. "Miss Crawford," he said, his voice carrying across the silent mesa. "We were wrong." The admission hung in the clear air, simple and complete. "Our wells are dry. The river's gone. There's nothing left down there but dust and desperation. We're thirsty, Sarah, and we're asking humbly if you'll share what you've built." Sarah looked at their faces, saw children with cracked lips and hollow cheeks, saw women whose hands shook from dehydration, saw men whose pride had been burned away by the sun. She could make them wait, make them suffer just a little longer. Or she could do what Samuel would have done. "Follow me," she said. Sarah walked to the stone hut that marked the entrance to 6 months of solitary labor. She placed her hand on the door, felt the heat radiating from sun-baked rock, and turned to face the gathered townspeople. "The ladder is strong. It will hold 200 pounds. One person at a time. Wait for the person ahead to reach bottom before you descend." She opened the door. A wave of cool air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of wet stone and deep earth. The crowd gasped collectively, a sound of involuntary wonder. Sarah gestured to the opening. "Mr. Brennan, you first." Marcus Brennan approached the shaft entrance like a man walking to judgment. He peered down into darkness, broken only by the glow of lanterns Sarah had lit earlier. He gripped the ladder and began his descent. The crowd watched him disappear, foot by foot, until only the sound of his boots on wood remained. Then silence. Then, from below, a sound none of them had expected. A sob. Not of grief, of something else entirely. Sarah descended next, her movements practiced and efficient. Behind her, the others followed one by one. Emma Brennan, pale and determined. John Miller, the farmer who'd laughed at the town hall. Clara Wells, moving carefully on arthritic knees. Robert Webb, the Peterson family with their 3 children. At the base of the shaft, 16 feet below the mesa surface, Marcus Brennan stood transfixed. The central chamber opened before him, carved from living rock with a precision that spoke of deliberate engineering. The ceiling arched overhead 7 feet at its peak, following the natural compression dome. Lanterns hung from iron hooks, their light reflecting off surfaces that glistened with moisture. But it was the galleries that stopped the breath in his lungs. 4 openings led from the chamber, aligned to the cardinal directions, each one a tunnel extending into darkness. From those tunnels came sound, the musical dripping of water, a rhythmic percussion that echoed through the chamber like a heartbeat. And in the chamber's center, carved into the floor itself, the reservoir, 10 feet across, 5 feet deep, filled with water so clear that Brennan could see every detail of the chiseled stone bottom as if through glass. Marcus Brennan, who had built an empire on the assumption of water's abundance, who had dismissed geological evidence because it contradicted his experience, who had sabotaged this very project out of certainty that it would fail, fell to his knees at the reservoir's edge. Behind him, the others descended one by one. Each arrival brought the same reaction: the sharp intake of breath, the stunned silence, the slow comprehension of what they were witnessing. A young woman knelt at the reservoir's edge, cupped her hands, and brought water to her lips. She drank, and the relief that crossed her face was so profound, it bordered on religious ecstasy. Others followed. The Peterson children splashing their faces, Marcus Brennan filling his canteen with shaking hands, Clara Wells drinking deeply. The chamber filled with the quiet sounds of desperate thirst being slaked. No one spoke. Finally, after every person had drunk their fill, Marcus Brennan rose from the reservoir's edge and turned to Sarah. "How?" The word came out broken. "How did you do this alone?" Sarah's gaze moved from him to the others. "My grandfather's calculations were exact. The geology was never in question. The Redemption Sandstone Formation holds water in its matrix in the spaces between sand grains. It's been accumulating for thousands of years. I didn't create the water. I simply created the conditions for it to release itself." She gestured to the galleries, 200 feet of horizontal excavation, 2,000 square feet of exposed water-bearing surface. Each square foot seeps approximately 0.05 gallons per day. The mathematics compound. The stone weeps. The water collects. The system sustains itself. Miller's voice was quiet, almost reverential. "You did this with a pickaxe and a hand drill." "And patience," Sarah added. "Rock doesn't respond to force. It responds to persistence. You can't hurry geology. You can only work with it." The lesson hung in the cool air of the chamber. Emma Brennan, 14 years old and still recovering from fever, spoke into the silence. "Thank you, Miss Crawford, for not giving up when we told you to quit, for being right when we were wrong." Sarah's expression softened fractionally. "I wasn't being right for the sake of argument, Emma. I was being right because lives depended on it, including yours." They ascended from the chamber in reverse order, emerging into the late afternoon sun like sleepers waking from a shared dream. Sarah was the last to emerge. She sealed the chamber's access hatch and turned to face the assembled townspeople. Marcus Brennan cleared his throat hat still in his hands. "We'll pay you. Whatever price you ask for the water, name it." Sarah looked out over the valley at the dead river and the dying trees. She thought about the cattle that had perished, the families that had fled, the children who'd fallen sick. All of it unnecessary. All of it the result of stubborn pride masquerading as practical wisdom. "The water isn't for sale," she said. Confusion rippled through the crowd. "Miss Crawford, I don't understand. You've invested 6 months of labor, your grandfather's knowledge, everything you have. You deserve compensation." "I deserve respect for expertise," Sarah corrected. "I deserve acknowledgement that geological evidence trumps comfortable assumptions. But the water itself, that's not mine to sell. It belongs to the formation that yielded it. I'm just the engineer who asked the stone correctly." She let that settle before continuing. But there will be terms, not payment. Responsibility. From her pocket, she withdrew a folded sheet of paper covered in her precise handwriting. First, a community water trust will be established. I'll manage it for the first year, training a successor. Every family in the valley will have equal access based on need, not wealth. Nods of agreement. Second, rationing. The system yields approximately 100 gallons per day sustainable. That's 10 gallons per person for a population of 10. As the population grows, individual shares decrease proportionally. Conservation becomes mandatory. More nods. Third, every household will send one member for training in the system's operation and maintenance. This knowledge will not die with one person. It will become common wisdom. Clara Wells spoke up. What principles specifically, Sarah? Geology, hydrology, the relationship between porosity and permeability, how groundwater moves, how to read the land, how to respect water as a finite resource rather than an infinite gift. Fourth, documentation. I've kept detailed journals of the excavation process, the engineering decisions, the flow calculations. These will be copied and stored in 3 separate locations. If this system fails, if it needs repair, if another community faces similar drought, the knowledge exists to replicate it. And fifth, Sarah looked at Marcus Brennan directly. My grandfather's name will be engraved on the wellhead, built on the geological surveys of Samuel Crawford executed by his granddaughter, Sarah Crawford, 1879. His knowledge made this possible. That gets acknowledged. Permanently. Brennan's jaw worked, but when he spoke, his voice was steady. All 5 terms are accepted, without modification. You have the town's word, Sarah. Then we'll begin pipeline installation tomorrow morning. I'll need 20 able bodies. The logs are prepared. The route is surveyed. If we work efficiently, water will flow to the town square within 10 days. The crowd dispersed slowly, people lingering to look at the stone hut, at the pipeline sections waiting to be installed, at the woman who'd carved salvation from rock. Sarah watched them go, then turned to her work journals and began planning the next phase with the same methodical precision she'd brought to excavation. The pipeline installation became a community effort that transformed more than infrastructure. 20 men and women assembled on the mesa at dawn the next morning, tools in hand, ready to work under Sarah's direction. She'd expected resistance to taking orders from a 19-year-old woman. Instead, she found an attention so focused it bordered on reverence. She organized them into teams with the efficiency of a military engineer. 4 people to haul log sections. 6 to dig the trench along the route she'd surveyed. 4 to mix pine pitch for sealing. 6 to install and test each connection. Marcus Brennan worked alongside his ranch hands. John Miller operated a shovel with the same hands that had dismissed Sarah's plans 6 months prior. Clara Wells oversaw the pitch mixing team. Sarah moved between work groups, checking alignment, testing joints, correcting errors with patient instruction. The grade needs to be consistent. 2 degrees of slope, no more, no less. Too steep, and the flow velocity damages the joints. Too shallow, and sediment accumulates. Use the level. Trust the instrument, not your eye. They used the level. At each pipeline section, Sarah demonstrated the sealing process herself before allowing others to attempt it. The work progressed with satisfying efficiency. 10 feet of pipeline per day, 20 feet. By the end of the first week, 200 feet of hollow log descended the mesa's eastern slope, sealed and tested, ready to carry water. On July 3rd, 9 days after the townspeople's first descent into the chamber, the pipeline was complete. 240 feet of gravity-fed distribution system connected the mesa to the valley, terminating at a stone cistern Sarah had designed for the town square. The inaugural flow was scheduled for Independence Day. The entire remaining population of Redemption Valley gathered in the square as dawn broke on July 4th, 1879. Perhaps 70 souls, all that remained of the 200 who'd called this place home a year before. Sarah Crawford adjusted the control valve at the cistern's inlet. She opened it one full turn. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. The pipeline was empty, needing to fill from the mesa reservoir down the slope. Then from the outlet pipe a trickle emerged. Clear water, cold from its underground source, splashing into the stone cistern with a sound like rain on a roof. The trickle became a stream. The stream became a steady flow. Water level rose in the cistern 1 inch, 2 inches, 6 inches. Sarah adjusted the valve to half open. The flow slowed to a sustainable rate, 8 gallons per hour, exactly as calculated. No one cheered. The moment was too profound for celebration. Children pressed forward, dipping their hands in water that didn't taste of sulfur or sickness. Women filled buckets with careful reverence. Men simply stood and watched. Marcus Brennan approached the cistern with a metal cup. He filled it, drank, lowered it slowly. "It's cold," he said, wonder in his voice. "In July, in this heat, it's cold." The formation is 16 feet below surface, Sarah explained. Underground temperature remains constant year-round, approximately 55 degrees. The water travels through stone never exposed to sun. She let them process this, then added the practical caveat. This cistern holds 200 gallons. At the current flow rate, it will refill completely every 25 hours. The distribution schedule is posted: 10 gallons per household per day, drawn during assigned hours. Violate the schedule and everyone's share decreases. Honor it and the system sustains everyone. Emma Brennan spoke up. "What happens when more people come back? When families return?" Sarah met her eyes. "Then we build additional systems. The mesa isn't the only formation in the territory. My grandfather mapped 17 similar structures within 200 miles. Each one could support a qanat if someone knows how to build it. The implication hung in the air: someone would need to learn." The school began informally on July 10th. Sarah had no classroom, no textbooks, no credentials beyond 6 months of practical engineering, and a dead man's journal. What she had was knowledge that could save lives, and a recognition that knowledge hoarded was knowledge wasted. She announced lessons would be held at the mesa on Sunday afternoons. Anyone could attend, just a willingness to learn. 11 people showed up the first week. Sarah stood at the stone hut entrance, Samuel's journal open in her hands, and began with the most fundamental concept. This is sedimentary rock. It forms from compressed sediment layer upon layer over millions of years. The spaces between the grains create porosity. The connection between those spaces creates permeability. Porosity is storage. Permeability is flow. She held up a sample of redemption sandstone, passing it around the circle. Feel the texture. Gritty. That's quartz grains. The reddish color is iron oxide. Now lick your finger and press it to the surface. Hesitation, then compliance. 11 people moistening the stone. Notice how the water disappears, absorbed into the pore spaces. That's capillary action, the same force that draws water through the galleries and into the collection system. Marcus Brennan raised his hand like a schoolboy. How did you know how deep to dig before hitting the sandstone? Sarah flipped to Samuel's cross-section maps. Geological survey. My grandfather spent 20 years mapping this region. He measured exposed strata in cliff faces, correlated them across distances, calculated the dip angle of the formations. The math told him where the sandstone would be. The math was right. The second week brought 18 students. Sarah taught rock identification. Limestone versus sandstone versus shale. How to recognize water-bearing formations. The third week, 23 students. Sarah taught the Kanat principle. How horizontal galleries maximize surface area. How gradient controlled flow. John Miller worked through the calculations on a slate board, checking his arithmetic against Sarah's. It's elegant, he said. Brutal work to execute, but the concept is elegant. All good engineering is elegant, Sarah replied. If it's complicated, you don't understand it well enough yet. By August, the lessons had evolved into something approaching a formal curriculum. Clara Wells became her assistant, helping manage the growing class size, preparing rock samples, copying diagrams. Marcus Brennan attended every session, sitting in the front row taking meticulous notes. His transformation from antagonist to devoted student would have been remarkable if it hadn't been so complete. One evening after class, he approached Sarah as she packed her materials. I owe you an apology. A real one. I sabotaged your work. I mocked you. I tried to buy you off. And you saved my daughter's life anyway. Sarah paused in her packing. You were operating from the best knowledge you had, Mr. Brennan. That knowledge was incomplete. Now it's better. That's how learning works. Still, I'm sorry. Apology accepted. Now show me your calculations for the Peterson Ranch survey. I want to see if you've accounted for the elevation differential. He pulled out his slate and they worked through the problem together. Teacher and student, the age difference and the gender difference and the history between them, rendered irrelevant by the pursuit of understanding. The valley recovered slowly through the remainder of 1879. The water from Sarah's system didn't restore the river or make the drought disappear, but it provided enough for survival, for modest agriculture, for livestock maintained at sustainable levels. Families who'd fled began to return, drawn by news that Redemption Valley had water when surrounding regions didn't. The population climbed back to 120 souls by September. Additional Kanat systems were planned for 2 other mesa formations within 20 miles. Teams of Sarah's students surveyed the sites, ran the calculations, presented their findings for her review. In October, work began on the second system led by John Miller under Sarah's supervision. A third team prepared to start a system in November. The knowledge was spreading exactly as Sarah had intended. By December, a small wooden structure had been erected near the town square, officially designated as the Redemption Valley School of Geology and Hydraulic Engineering. Sarah taught there twice a week. She was 20 years old. June 1880 arrived with the weather patterns finally shifting, bringing rain that was sporadic but real. The drought hadn't broken, but it had eased. The Redemption River ran again, though at a fraction of its former volume. But the Kanat systems remained the primary source, reliable, constant, proven. Sarah stood in the schoolhouse on a warm afternoon teaching a class of 25 students ranging from 16 to 68 years old. An older man, weathered by decades of ranching, raised his hand. "Miss Crawford, when you were digging that first system alone on the mesa, did you ever doubt? Ever think you might be wrong?" Sarah considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Every day, doubt is healthy. It keeps you checking your calculations. What matters isn't the absence of doubt. It's whether you let doubt paralyze you, or whether you test it against evidence. The stone didn't care about my confidence. It only responded to correct engineering. She dismissed the class at 4 o'clock and spent an hour cleaning the schoolhouse, organizing rock samples, preparing the next week's lesson plans. As she locked the schoolhouse door, she realized she hadn't visited the Mesa system in 3 weeks. Miller managed it now along with a rotating team of trained maintainers. Sarah's role had shifted from builder to teacher, from engineer to custodian of knowledge. She rode up the trail as the sun descended. The mesa top held a quality of eternal patience. The wind moved through the juniper with the same sound it had made for 10,000 years. She approached the stone hut unlocked. It descended into the chamber she'd carved from darkness. The lanterns were lit, maintained by whoever had drawn water that day. The reservoir stood at its usual level, 4 feet of clear water, reflecting the ceiling's arch. From the 4 galleries came the eternal sound of dripping water, seeping from stone in patient accumulation. Sarah walked the chamber's perimeter, trailing her hand along the wall, feeling the moisture that had become as familiar as her own skin. The crooked fingers of her left hand traced the carved channels that guided water to collection. Everything functioned exactly as designed. As she completed her circuit of the chamber, something caught her eye. A slight irregularity in the western wall near the base. A stone that didn't quite sit flush with its neighbors. She knelt, examining it. The stone was loose, deliberately placed rather than carved. She worked it free, revealing a cavity behind it. Inside the hollow, wrapped in oilcloth, was a sealed envelope. Her name written on it in Samuel's precise hand. Sarah's fingers trembled as she retrieved it, as she sat on the stone bench she'd carved 6 months before, as she broke the seal and unfolded the letter within. The paper was her grandfather's stationery. The ink was his preferred brown. "My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, you have succeeded. The system is built. The water flows. The valley that dismissed you now depends on you. I knew you would do it. Not hoped. Knew. I placed this letter here 3 months before my death during my last climb to the mesa. I carved the hiding place during my final survey when the tremor in my hands made the work take 3 times as long as it once did. I wanted to leave you something more than calculations and maps. I wanted to leave you truth. You succeeded not because you are strong though you are, not because you are intelligent though you are. You succeeded because you listen. You hear what the earth says when others hear only silence. You see what stone teaches when others see only obstacles. This gift, the ability to read the land, to understand water's patience, to work with geology rather than against it. This is your true inheritance, not the mesa, not the system, the wisdom to see what others miss. I am so deeply proud of you. I was proud when you were 9 years old and identified limestone by taste. I was proud when you were 12 and corrected my triangulation math. I was proud when you were 16 and asked why humans persist in fighting nature instead of learning from it. And I am proud now as I write this, knowing I will not live to see your triumph, but absolutely certain that triumph will come. But here is the final lesson. The one I learned too late in life to execute myself. Knowledge hoarded is knowledge wasted. You have built this system with your hands and your mind. Now you must build something more important. You must build understanding in others. Teach them, Sarah, not just the engineering, but the patience. Not just the calculations, but the humility to accept evidence over assumption. Not just the techniques, but the wisdom to see water as a finite gift requiring respect. Make sure this knowledge never dies with one person, as it nearly died with me. Make sure the next drought finds a valley that knows how to read stone, that understands aquifers, that respects geology. This is your work now, not digging, teaching. I love you. I am proud of you. The stone will always weep for those patient enough to ask. Your grandfather, Samuel Crawford. Sarah sat in the chamber she'd carved, the letter held in her scarred hands. Tears streaming down her face in the private darkness where they belonged. She had built the system to honor his memory. She had taught others to honor his knowledge. But this letter, these words, confirmed something she'd only half believed. She'd been right to share rather than hoard. Right to teach rather than monopolize. Right to see this work as beginning rather than completion. Samuel had known she would need this confirmation. Had known she would doubt whether teaching was as important as building. Had known she would climb down into this chamber one more time and find his final lesson waiting. She folded the letter carefully, tucked it into her journal alongside his calculations and her own notes, creating a continuous record of knowledge passed through generations. Then she ascended the ladder, emerged into sunset, painting the valley gold, and locked the chamber behind her. The mesa stretched empty around her. The valley spread below. And on the horizon, other formations waited. Other aquifers held water in patient stone. Other communities needed the knowledge she carried. Sarah Crawford, 20 years old, keeper of the water teacher of geology, stood on the rock her grandfather had purchased for a pittance and seen for what it truly was. Not worthless stone, not obstacle, but library, teacher, partner. She placed her hand on sun-warmed rock and spoke aloud to the stone and the sky and the memory of the man who'd taught her to listen. I understand now. The work isn't finished. It's barely started. But I'm ready. The wind moved through juniper with the sound of ancient approval. The sun descended behind mountains that had watched this drama play out across 10 million years, and would watch for 10 million more. And in the stone beneath her feet, in the darkness 16 feet down, water continued its patient seepage, molecule by molecule, drop by drop, sustained by geology and mathematics, and the knowledge that some things cannot be rushed or forced, only understood and honored. Sarah rode down the trail as stars emerged, carrying her grandfather's letter and her own resolve, heading toward a valley that had learned to respect what it could not control and to value those who understood what it did not. The mesa stood eternal behind her. The water flowed constant below, and the knowledge passed from Samuel to Sarah, to all who came after, ensured that neither stone nor wisdom would be wasted again.